Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be reading an article and analyzing and providing commentary on this article from Forbes on 1 year after Russia annexed Crimea, locals prefer Moscow to Kyiv. And yes, this article is from 2015, but it's extremely relevant for modern times because of the Ukraine conflict. Russia says that Crimea is a historical part of Russia and that the locals want to be a part of Russia. Ukraine says it is a part of Ukraine and has been a part of Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union and even a little bit before that as well. And while the people might not be ethnically Ukrainian, because of their sovereignty as a nation, they're allowed to maintain control of Crimea. So I, as you can probably tell, already think that Russia has a stronger claim to Crimea, given the fact that the population is nearly entirely either Russian or Russian-speaking Ukrainians. But let's see what the actual population of Crimea thinks after Crimea joined Russia. So the US and European Union may want to save Crimeans from themselves, but the Crimeans are happy right where they are. And just as a reminder again, this is from Forbes, okay? So this is not a Russian propaganda outlet. 1 year after the annexation of the Ukrainian peninsula in the Black Sea, poll after poll shows that the locals there, be they Ukrainians, which very few of them there, most are ethnic Russians or Tatars. Tatars are former rulers of that area. They make up a small portion of the population. They were former rulers hundreds of years ago. But all these different groups are mostly all in agreement. Life with Russia is better than life with Ukraine. So just to point out, Ukraine was far poorer than Russia, and it became even more poor after the democratically elected government of Ukraine was overthrown in 2014. So interesting little tidbit there, but the joining the West, overthrowing their democratically elected government did not help them, did not make them richer as a nation or as individuals within a nation. It probably made a few oligarchs very rich, but overall it was not beneficial to the nation as a whole. So little has changed over the last 12 months, despite huge efforts on the part of Kyiv, Brussels, Washington, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The bulk of humanity living on the Black Sea Peninsula believe the referendum to cede from Ukraine was legit. Yeah. The bulk of humanity living there thinks that it's legit, that Crimea joined Russia. At some point, the West will have to recognize Crimea's right to self-rule, unless we are all to believe that the locals polled by Gallup and GFK were doing so with FSB boogeymen standing by with guns in their hands. Okay, so people would have you believe that it's the Russians polling the Crimean population at gunpoint, but Gallup is a very well-established American Western polling agency. I don't know as much about GFK. I believe it's German, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But Gallup for sure is extremely prestigious, and you'd have to tarnish Gallup's reputation as a polling agency to say that they're wrong in this specific case. And I've not seen anyone doing that. I've seen just bad faith arguments saying that, well, it's the Russians polling the Crimean population at gunpoint, which is just obviously silly because Gallup would not be saying that they're the ones doing the polling if they weren't the ones doing the polling. In June 2014, a Gallup poll with the Broadcasting Board of Governors asked Crimeans if the results of March 16, 2014 referendum to cede reflected the views of the people. A total of 82.8% of Crimeans said yes. Okay. So one thing to mention here as a point against this poll is any Ukrainians that did not agree with this poll probably left the country by then. But if you look at polls from before Crimea joined Russia, the polls were relatively similar in terms of the number of people who were in favor of joining Russia. So a total of 82.8% of the remaining population within Crimea said yes. When broken down by ethnicity, 93.6% of ethnic Russians said they believed the vote to cede was legitimate, while okay, so this is how many people think it's actually a legitimate vote, while 68.4% of Ukrainians felt so. Okay. I believe this is only... Yeah, this is only Ukrainians. Okay, so this is only Ukrainians that are in Crimea at the time. But you still see a majority of Ukrainians saying that the vote was legitimate. Moreover, when asked if joining Russia will ultimately make life better for them and their families, 73.9% said yes, while 5.5% said no. Okay, so I imagine the rest are undecided there. In February, a poll by the German polling firm GFK, so I was correct about the location of GFK, revealed that attitudes have not changed. When asked, do you endorse Russia's annexation? Oh, wait a minute. When was this? Oh, okay. So they were talking about, okay, if the results, okay. So this prior poll from Gallup was in June 2014, asking if the March 16th, 2014, vote to join Russia was accurate. And then again in February 2015, the German polling station did a poll, and about the same amount said yes, 82% yes. Okay, so that something to remember here is it's slightly different, 82 versus 82.8. And that is within what I would suspect is the margin of error. And so whenever you poll, you're polling a random subsample of the overall population. And so there's going to be a margin of error. So there's going to be some fluctuation in the numbers. And just eyeballing it, not knowing any other data, I would assume the margin of error is probably like a few percentage points. And so it being 82 versus 82.8%, that's completely legitimate. So you have multiple different polling agencies conducting polls at different times. And we can kind of triangulate that. At the very least, this is accurate data, and we only have 2 polls, but we can say with a somewhat high degree of confidence that this is at least somewhat accurate data representing the post-Crimea joining Russia population, what their perspective is. Oh, wait a minute. A total of 82% of the respondents answered yes, definitely, and another 11% answered yes for the most part. Okay, so that's interesting, because that would actually tell you either people moved out, and so you're getting a different population. Maybe some of the Ukrainians who didn't feel like the vote was legitimate, maybe they moved out by this point because it's been a year, almost a year. But this is showing a much higher percentage. It'd be nice to see the demographics of the participants in each of these polls to see, did they get more Ukrainians in the first poll, ethnic Ukrainians in the first poll, versus in the second poll, maybe some of the ethnic Ukrainians who disagree with the vote left. But you see here that I would say this is a substantial increase, actually, outside of the margin of error, if you include both of these. Another 11% answered yes for the most part. Only 2% said they didn't know, and another 2% said no. So maybe, aside from ethnic Ukrainians leaving, or just people in general who disagree with the vote leaving, another potential thing that could have happened here is maybe a lot of the undecided voters, because we saw in the first poll there were a lot of undecided voters, that maybe they made more of a decision about whether they thought Russia, joining Russia was a good idea or not. With 2 studies out of the way, both Western-based, it seems without question that the vast majority of Crimeans do not feel they were duped into voting for annexation, and that life with Russia will be better for them and their families than life with Ukraine. A year ago this week, 83% of Crimeans went to the polling station, and almost 97% expressed support for reunification with their former Soviet parent. Okay, so when you're seeing... the numbers aren't that different. The majority of people living on the peninsula are ethnic Russians. Yes, we already know that. Okay, so let's think about this. That was a March 16th, 2014 was when the referendum happened. And you have 93% saying yes. And here you have 97% voting for reunification. So the second poll was actually a lot more similar to the referendum than the first poll. The first poll, I would say, underestimated support, as long as we are thinking that the referendum was legitimate. But all the same, it seems pretty overwhelming that the Crimean population wanted to join Russia. I think that's almost without dispute, I would say, unless you're making bad faith arguments about Russia holding people at gunpoint in order to vote in a certain way. The US made a big deal about the rights of ethnic minorities there, known as the Tatars, which account for around 10% of the population. Of the 4% total that said they did not endorse Russia's annexation, the vast majority, 55%, said that they feel that way because they believe it should have been allowed by Kyiv in accordance with international law. Okay, what are they trying to say there? They did not. The vast majority said they feel that way because they believe it should have been allowed by Kyiv in accordance with international law. Another 20. I don't know what they're trying to say there. So they're saying that it would have been a legitimate annexation as long as Kyiv agreed with it. I mean, typically nation states do not agree to cede territory. I mean, Serbia did not agree to cede Kosovo. Spain did not agree to cede the Catalonia region. I mean, you don't typically see places agreeing to cede areas. So having 4% of the total saying that they did not endorse Russia's annexation, and a majority saying they only would have accepted it if Kyiv accepted it. That's a weird thing to ask, and it's also a weird thing for people to say, because I don't think a nation state would see territory like that. But maybe someone else has another interpretation. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. Another 24% said the referendum vote was held under pressure, which means political or military threats to vote and vote in favor. Okay. So is this for... It doesn't say specifically, but since the most recent poll was the GFK poll, I would say that these voting results talked about in this paragraph are probably from the GFK poll. But again, clarity is an issue in this article. It's a Forbes article, but they should have said, where did these numbers come from exactly? Is it the Gallup article or the GFK article? So it says the vote was held under pressure. I would like to know the wording in that, because you could interpret that as pressure from Russia or pressure from Ukraine, because it is an area ceding from Ukraine. And so if they worded this ambiguously, then people could have interpreted it in either way. And so that 24% means absolutely nothing, because it could mean that 24% think that they were under pressure from Ukraine, or 24% think they were under pressure from Russia, or some mix in between. You need to have a clear question in order to get accurate results here. The GFK survey also asked if those results in the prior paragraph, while it wasn't outright stated, I believe the first sentence here does tell us that those results were from the GFK study. Survey also asked if the Ukrainian media have given Crimea a fair assessment. Only 1% said that the Ukrainian media provides entirely truthful information, and only 4% said it was more often truthful than deceitful. Wow, that's impressive, because those numbers are not only including the people who supported the Crimean annexation, but also people who did not support the Crimean annexation, and only 4% said it was more often truthful than deceitful. I believe that 4% can be combined with the 1%. It's not already including the 1%. So about 5% said the Ukrainian media is mostly truthful. That is concerning, that even a lot of the people who did not agree with the annexation do not think it's truthful. So you have at least half saying that the Ukrainian media is not being honest. Very concerning. Because you would think that, like, if you're in favor of not being annexed, then you would think that you would agree with the media that's, like, supporting you. But if you're not agreeing with the media that's supporting you, that's telling you that they're, like, really, really, really wrong, because you're going against the people who are on your side. You're saying that they're lying, right? For now, the Gallup and GFK polls show a deeply divided Ukraine. Does it really, though? Because those seemed overwhelmingly in favor of Crimea joining Russia. The division of political allegiances ultimately threatens Ukraine's territorial integrity. Only 19% in the east and 26.8% in the southeast think Ukraine should join the European Union. Okay, so you see that split there. While 84.2% in the West believe Ukraine is a natural fit with the European Union. Nearly 60% in the North agree that EU is the place to be. And just under half in the center part of the country want EU integration. Okay, interesting. NATO integration is even less supported in the Southeast and East, and a little over a third in the center and North agree that Ukraine should join the Western military powers. In the West, that number rises to 53%. Well, that's really interesting. Even the West doesn't have overwhelming numbers of supporters for NATO integration, which is hilarious because a lot of this conflict is because of the fact that various Ukrainian leaders want to join NATO, and various NATO leaders are saying that Ukraine could join NATO eventually. And so the fact that you don't really have overwhelming support, I would say in the West even, those numbers are probably within the margin of error. Probably. I mean, usually it's like plus or minus 3, so it could be about 50-50 if we're being very cautious there in favor of NATO integration versus not integration. So wow, those numbers, shocking. We have a war where hundreds of thousands, likely in the future, millions of people are dying and millions more being displaced for NATO integration that no one really wanted aside from the elites in NATO and in Ukraine. Those numbers also coincide with Ukraine's trust or distrust with Washington. The pro-integration West, North, and center portions of Ukraine all view the U.S. role in the crisis as mostly positive. The pro-integration. I don't know if I would even call them pro-integration, West, North, and center. So they're definitely not pro-integration for NATO. The West seems mostly pro-integration with EU, but the North and center really could tilt either way, but considering the media apparatus of Ukraine is oriented towards the West, the Western world, then, I mean, even that is mostly just them being persuaded in the North and in the center. So that was not, this is a Forbes article. This is not Russian propaganda. So hearing that they can't even get good results that are pro-Western from this, given these are two Western firms that are conducting the study, that's really concerning for Western propaganda. I'm surprised that this hasn't gotten more attention. I think it probably got a lot of attention back in 2015, but it should have gotten a lot more attention after the start of the conflict in Ukraine in 2022. Okay, pro-integration. Well, under a third say so in the East and Southeast, and almost no one, including the Tatars, believes so in Crimea, GFK poll data suggests. All view the U.S. role in the crisis as mostly positive. So not even the Tatars, who don't really have a stake in this. They don't have their own homeland anymore. Like, they're not in control. They're not a sovereign nation. They're like, yeah, actually the Russians are right and the United States is lying. So concerning that you just have so many different sources saying that the West is lying. Interestingly enough, that's the thing. Okay, so I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but people in the West have a Batman, Superman idea about morality, and they don't understand that sometimes there are reasons to start, and I'm not agreeing with this, but if you have a complex understanding of morality, sometimes there are reasons for a physical confrontation. And for some reason, they're under the impression that physical confrontations that the West initiates are not really physical confrontations, but when anyone initiates physical confrontations with the Western world, that they're like super morally corrupt and bankrupt and morally bankrupt in some way, shape, or form. And it's just a weird mentality where it's like, you can't see a reason for any sort of conflict. But I mean, these conflicts arise for a reason. There are reasons to, I don't want to get too deeply into it, but there are some complexities to it. It's not just Batman, Superman levels of morality, which I see way too often in the West. People just do not have a complex sense of morality. Interestingly enough, despite Russia's involvement in the separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, only 35.7% of people polled there said they viewed Russia's involvement as mostly positive. Oh. While 71.3% of Crimeans were more aligned with Russia's worldview, according to the year-old poll from Gallup. Okay, so just to read this, Crimea strongly in support of Russia. But I need to think more about this for a second. Eastern Ukraine only, they viewed Russia's involvement. Okay, so are they saying only 35.7% of people polled there in the Donbass area said they viewed Russia's involvement as mostly positive? See, that's the thing. This is really unclear wording. Involvement as mostly, well, so we're more in line with Russia's worldview. Yeah. People polled there. Separatist movement. Only people. Okay, so I think this has to be Eastern Ukraine. But that's striking. So that's one point. I will admit that these Western polling sources apparently do not agree with. They're saying that the people polled in Eastern Ukraine do not agree with Russia's involvement in Eastern Ukraine, which is interesting. I will completely concede the point because I don't have any data to the contrary. This week, the State Department's press secretary, Jen Psaki, said sanctions on Russia will continue until Crimea is returned to Ukraine. Both the State Department and Treasury Department did not clarify whether that included the sectoral sanctions, which were applied in a third round of sanctions last July following the downing of the Malaysian flight MH17 over East Ukraine. So, interesting results. The only thing, so this is a Western news outlet. The two polling centers are Western polling centers, and they only really had one point that favored them, and that was the Eastern Ukrainians not being in favor of Russian involvement in Eastern Ukraine, which I'd have to see other data to see. See, typically the way you want to do it is if you see data that supports the author's viewpoints, you want to get other sources of data. But if the authors are giving you data that runs contrary to their own biases, you can probably think that that's relatively legitimate data because they wouldn't be showing it to you if they had any other choice because it goes against what their own biases, what their own perspective is. And so because this is a Western news outlet with Western polling centers, I feel a lot more confident in their results that are non-pro-Western versus the one result that is pro-Western, because it stands out as something that they would be supporting. And so I'd have to see in a lot more detail why this result runs contrary to everything else in the poll. But interesting results overall. I'm really glad that we took the time to analyze this and come back to this, because at the very least, this makes the case for Crimea's integration into Russia. But we would have to study a little bit further about things like Eastern Ukraine, because this result is kind of like confusing me, I would say, because it stands in stark contrast to everything else we've been saying. But fascinating stuff. So thank you for sticking with me. And if you like this content, please actually like the video. I appreciate it. It helps me in the algorithm. And please subscribe to our channel for more content. I'm going to be producing a ton of content. I love making these videos. It's a lot of fun for me. Seeing that I have hundreds of returning viewers and tens of thousands of unique viewers every single month is fascinating to me. I love being a teacher, a professor, and so this cool stuff, very cool stuff. So thank you for sticking with me, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.